Hello there, this is Nantogias. It's been a while since my last proper video. Yeah, I'll get into stuff about the channel after the main topic of this video, which is my thoughts on The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings books. This is gonna be more off the cuff than my other videos with less scripting and editing than normal. It's just going to be my thoughts on the series a month after I've let it sit in my mind, with some gameplay of either Fate Grand Order, TF2 or Half-Life in the background. Haven't really decided. So, about a month ago, I finished The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings books, including the appendices, and also watched the Peter Jackson trilogy, but not The Hobbit though. I probably shouldn't have watched it before making this, since I might accidentally mix up some movie stuff with book stuff, but hey, it is what it is. And yeah, this is going to be focusing on the books, not the movies, because I really want to talk about this incredible story. And no, I haven't read the Silmarillion. Before starting The Hobbit, I already had some knowledge of the series. In fact, they were probably what motivated me to take this plunge. I had watched Death Battle Sauron vs the Lich King, which is still one of my favorite episodes. Watching Sauron in that episode was probably what tipped me over into reading the book because of how awesomely he was depicted in that episode. The other was CGP Grey's 2 videos on the series, both of which really fueled my desire to learn more about this epic mythos. And the epic rap battle really showcased just how legendary Tolkien was. Also this green text video of Tolkien naming his characters, which I thought was hilarious. So let's just get into the books. Now, what did I think of The Hobbit? I'd say it was a good little book, though I had some gripes with it. I like Bilbo as the main character in this story, showing how he grew from a simple Baggins who wanted to keep to himself in his hole, to the courageous elf friend who embraced his Tookside's love for adventure. It's a very simple arc, but it's pulled off and serves the story quite well. This is not just in The Hobbit but The Lord of the Rings too, but I really love how traveling is depicted in the series. It doesn't feel like the characters just walk from one place of interest to another. The journey between the points themselves are like their own mini-stories. And it honestly also makes me want to go out on my own adventure. The setting is also what makes this book for me. It really feels like a whimsical fairy story with all the quirky stuff that happens, like when Gandalf had the dwarves enter Beorn's home in pairs. That sort of silly moment really only works in this type of story, and it blends surprisingly well with the more intense scenes like Riddles in the Dark, sneaking into the elf village, and Bilbo's meeting with Smaug. The Riddles in the Dark chapter was one of the best in the entire book. The tension with Gollum, the intrigue with the ring, and the riddles themselves all blended together extremely well. And knowing in advance about how important both Gollum and his precious ring would be made this scene and other scenes where Bilbo uses the ring all the more interesting. The scene with Smaug especially. I love this encounter for the tension, but also how well it characterizes Smaug in this short amount of time. You really get a sense for his intelligence and age with how easily he draws information out of Bilbo, and that he's mainly just playing along with him since he has no knowledge of the ring. And this helps make the world feel like it has such a rich history with all these ancient creatures and lineages. However, this is where some of the cracks begin to show in this narrative. There are quite a number of moments near the end where stuff just sort of happens, like the stuff with Bard and how Smaug just dies really quickly. I think Bard is cool, but he and his backstory just kind of pop into the story all of a sudden. Also, the Battle of the Five Armies just kind of happens, then Bilbo gets knocked out and the battle ends. I get that Tolkien wants to show how big the world is, and that there's more to it than Bilbo's part in the books, but it really doesn't feel that satisfactory with how it is incorporated in this, especially when it also eats into Thorin's own character arc. And that's another issue with the story. There are way too many dwarves introduced at once. It is quite a chore to remember all of them, especially when some of them have similar names to each other. And by the end of it, I feel like I barely knew most of them, even though we spent a lot of time with them. I just feel like the story would be a lot better if we cut out half of them. So overall, The Hobbit was a really fun, light read with really good character writing and an intriguing world, though its efforts to make the world bigger does detract from the narrative quite a bit. However, when it comes to The Lord of the Rings, not only are the positives amplified dramatically, but those negatives I mentioned do not even apply. Like, it's insane how good this book is in all aspects, and yes, I'll be talking about all of it in terms of one book, since Tolkien intended it to be read that way, and this video will be an hour long if I had to cover each book separately because it's really dense. Speaking of that, I want to talk about how tightly woven the narrative is throughout. When I first looked at the book thickness and how small the font is compared to The Hobbit, I was kind of worried about how long-winded it would be, but reading through it, it felt like everything that happened was necessary to the plot and no words were wasted. Like, even the Tom Bombadil chapter had a lot of important events to serve the story. It serves as foreshadowing for the end. The hobbits get the weapons, and he even guided them to the prancing pony. And also this is where Aragorn first met the hobbits. Tolkien has some incredible writing chops both here and in The Hobbit. I love his description of the worlds and the characters. I also adored all the moments of song in the story. I feel like they were sprinkled in really well in natural spots and didn't distract from the narrative. Though it is awkward to read since there obviously isn't music for the lyrics to be sung to. And also I really can't talk about Lord of the Rings without mentioning the language. Hearing how Tolkien basically invented the languages first and the world second is kind of mind-boggling to me, especially with how reserved he is in using it in the story. Because in most other stories, you usually see the authors create the languages as an afterthought without really thinking about how it fits in, and they use that one language constantly. Meanwhile, Tolkien has a ton of languages, and he barely even explores it. It's also used enough throughout to help sell the fantastical feel of the story, but not so much that it distracts. I think there were one or two times when he wrote a song entirely in the Elven language, which I'm sure it sounds beautiful, but I kind of have to skip past it because, well, I can't read it and I don't even know what the melody is. Reading Lord of the Rings really feels less like I'm reading a fantasy book and more like I'm reading a history/mythology text. The world is incredibly fleshed out, with every aspect feeling like it has its own history separate from the main tale. It really feels like I'm looking through a window into another world and not just somebody's imagination. When Tolkien writes of events from before the story and when he writes about the thereafter in the appendices, it feels genuine and not like sequel bait like with modern works. Another thing that really helps sell the world is how massive it is. Like how the Shire is apparently almost 50,000 square kilometers in area. I oftentimes while reading it refer to the map, only to realize how short the distance they traveled in each chapter really was. And there's just so much stuff in this world, with every new location having such distinctive identities. From the countryside community of the entire Shire, to the claustrophobic and dank Moria, to the magnificent city of Minas Tirith. Every place feels so lived in that if you drop them in another story, it would easily be the most fleshed out location there. And there's also a good attention to the flow of time here. Whenever we switch over to Frodo, we sometimes get a glimpse of stuff happening or heading towards where Aragorn is in the previous book. To the point where you can probably rearrange the chapters like in the movies, such that you constantly switch back and forth, and it would still flow pretty well. This attention to both the distance and time really goes a long way to make the world feel more authentic. In fact, the only time when it feels like characters just teleport is when Gandalf gets Shadowfax, which is kind of the point since Shadowfax is a fast boy. And after watching some videos on Lord of the Rings, you realize just how tight the timeline was. Gandalf arrived at Lothlorien the day after the Fellowship leave, and while they were traveling through the Anduin, all the stuff with Rohan was taking place. So yeah, it's really tightly woven. Now, I want to talk about the characters, which was one of the weak points in The Hobbit outside of Bilbo and Gandalf, and I love all the characters here. This continues my point on how well crafted the world is. Nearly all the characters in this story feel like actual people with actual history. Even minor characters and villains, such as the Saxville Bagginses, Hama from Book 3, Baragon and Birgil and Gunn and the Wildmen from Book 5, and even the Orcs are genuine characters with distinctive names and traits. We get a look at them during Merry and Pippin's and Frodo's capture, and I love seeing all the troubles the Orcs are getting up to. I'll be here all day if I have to talk about each character individually, and I will still not do them justice, so here's some brief thoughts on the important stuff. I love the 4 hobbits and the orcs throughout the story. It felt really natural, and you only really notice it at the end of the book when they put the skills to the test against Sauron. They all feel more relatable to the reader than the other Fellowship members in different ways. Frodo feels like the eldest child, being the wisest and most learned of the 4. Sam feels like the everyman with a big heart but screws up in small ways due to his inexperience. Merry is the street smart guy who figures stuff out faster than the others. and Pippin is the bright-eyed child of the group. Also, I want to note how all of them start off as hobbits who craved adventure and were willing to follow Frodo everywhere, only to remark later that if they knew all the dangers in the beginning, they never would have gone. Which is very clearly something Tolkien was well experienced with during World War I. I also really like Merry and Pippin's relationship with the two kingdoms of men, Pippin becoming the prince of halflings and Merry as Theoden's friend. It made them feel especially powerful during the Scouring as they return as Knights of the King. I will say though, before I talk about Frodo and Sam, that when reading that part, I was definitely less interested in it than Aragorn's part. Not to say it was bad, but compared to all the cool stuff there, these two definitely had the more lacking part. However, it was still a compelling story where we see Sam channel all his devotion into overcoming his clumsiness, all in order to save Frodo and support him to the cracks of doom. He basically becomes the main character during the 6th book, and with Frodo, throughout all of this, he becomes wiser to the world for better and for worse. He learned kindness and pity for Gollum, to the point that during the Scouring, it really felt like he was completely exhausted and depressed throughout. Also, I want to bring up Bill the Pony here because honestly I loved him even though he has a very small part at the beginning and the end. But Aragorn pretty much steals the show from the moment they leave Moria until the end. Actually, not even that, even from his introduction. There's just too many moments of pure awesomeness with him that I'll be yapping all day if I don't restrict it to just this one paragraph. I love how his wisdom and experience is showcased all throughout the adventure, especially after he took up Gandalf's role as the leader. He had such a perfect introduction where we were first highly suspicious of him before he more than earned our trust with his skills. And you can immediately tell how much better off the hobbits were after he joined by how different the track was written after they left Bree. Like before they met Aragorn, they felt like they were just wandering around with no place to go. But the moment Aragorn joined, they pretty much have a path mapped out and were able to reach Rivendell in a few days. And he remained this pillar of leadership to so many people. My favorite example was when he allowed his soldiers to, instead of following him to Mordor, he allowed them to go and defend Caer Andros instead, after sensing their nervousness. And even despite his excellent judgments in the later books, you can see him despair from the death of Gandalf to the breaking of the Fellowship, of how much he beats himself up for not being able to match up to Gandalf's guidance, making him feel more human and not as distant as Gandalf, which is probably why Legolas and Gimli felt confident in having him lead them. Now, before starting the series, Legolas was the character I probably had the most exposure to, so it came as a surprise to find out that he had a fairly minor role in the Fellowship along with Gimli. That's not to say they are bad characters, far from it. They add quite a lot to the world as representatives of their race. I loved watching their bromance develop throughout, or more accurately, immediately after leaving Lothlorien, especially because of how their personalities bounce off each other. Legolas is a lot more childlike than one would expect, while Gimli is kind of a stubborn old man. One of my favorite moments was when both of them agreed to take the other out for a date in the Helm's Deep's cave and Fangorn Forest when they return, which speaks to how much they want to share their own culture with each other, while showcasing that they were confident in the quest's success. I think they make great companions for Aragorn by showcasing his ability to lead two people who are his elder and showing the kinship between the three races of Middle-earth. I also love that scene in Lothlorien when Gandalf called all dwarves stubborn, only for Aragorn to just turn it on him when he asked for all the Fellowship to be blindfolded for fairness. The antagonists in this are also top-notch, all of them presenting a diverse amount of obstacles for the characters. Sauron, despite not even being shown and is physically distant from our heroes for most of the story, still commands an overwhelming amount of terror with an evil that looms throughout. There's the fact that Frodo is constantly carrying the ring, so he weighs ever present whenever the ring is brought up. He lives rent-free in all the characters' heads and they dare not even mutter his name or speak his language. You also get slowly drop-fed information about him through characters like Gollum and Gandalf, and we also get brief glimpses of him, like when Pippin stares into the Palantir, or when he notices Frodo was watching him, which was really terrifying to read. And this speaks to just how great Tolkien's writing truly is, where we know a fair amount and are constantly thinking of a character who only really shows up at the very end before he's defeated. Sauron is an interesting villain to me since we don't really deal with him directly until the end. We just hear Gandalf bring him up a few times, and when the Ents attack Isengard, we only get to see the devastation left behind, which on a side note was quite an amazing section. Tolkien spent a fair few pages describing the grand and impenetrable Isengard, only for us to enter its ruins and see Sauron trapped, where he gets humiliated further by having his staff broken. During the Scouring of the Shire, he really comes off as a pathetic fallen hero rather than Gandalf's superior. He tried to take power from Sauron but instead ended up only being a roadblock for the Fellowship, and he lost everything just to end up getting his throat slit by a simple man. Gollum is a really good sympathetic villain. While Saruman and Sauron are far off evil, Gollum is someone whom evil has taken a hold of, making him seem far closer than the other two. Throughout Frodo's journey, there's a real sense that he is slowly reverting back to Smeagol, and that he was right on the brink before Selob's lair. Like he might have been converted were Sam less suspicious of him, or if they had not run into Faramir. I personally did find the way he died a tad underwhelming, where he just simply slipped into the cracks of doom, but overall he made a great party member for both Frodo and Sam's quest. Now finally I want to talk about villains who are not really people, but more of primordial obstacles. Those being beings like the Balrog, Shelob, and to a lesser extent, Caradhras and the Watcher in the Water. These adversaries offer some of the most terrifying encounters in the books. All of them feel more like forces of nature, personal yet larger and more ancient than any of our heroes. Okay, Caradhras technically is a force of nature since it's a mountain, but you get what I'm saying. And the thing is, we only really destroy half of them. They once again help to reinforce the idea that the world is bigger than the characters, where the big bad Sauron isn't even the top dog in this world. Now before rounding this off, I want to briefly touch on both the prologue and the appendices. Honestly, I really like the prologue. It works well given that this is the sequel to The Hobbit. It goes more in depth into the Hobbit race than The Hobbit ever did, while helping to set up how diverse and large the Shire, and by extension Middle-earth, truly is. I also found myself more invested in the appendices than I thought I would be. It took a bit to get used to the style, but once it started talking about the lineage of Elendil, I was hooked. I particularly enjoyed the section about the dwarves and the history of Khazad-dûm. And I know I shouldn't, but I really want to try and learn how to read Tengwar. This is outside the book, but I want to mention just how many memes I only recently found out came from Lord of the Rings. Like this.
So you have chosen death.
Alright then, keep your secrets.
And there's so many more memes. When I got into series like Star Wars, Team Fortress 2, JoJo, and Toho, I knew about the memes going into them, and knew that these are franchises who were ingrained into the foundations of the internet. I was unaware that Lord of the Rings was just as important to the early internet as they were, and had just as many memes. So yeah, I had a grand time reading this series, and can see why it not only stood the test of time, but remained as one of the peaks of fiction in general. I'm not sure when I will read the Silmarillion or watch the Hobbit movies, but I will get to them eventually. Now, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like or dislike it if you didn't. The engagement helps me out either way. Also subscribe because I have some videos I want to release this month, including my Stardew Garden video, which I've been sitting on the audio for around 2 years. Also, I have a Twitter where I just retweet cool artwork and memes, and occasionally post stuff. Also, I have a Twitch where I might stream, but I also have a second channel where you can check out the VODs. Now, this is J.R.R signing out.